Hello everybody. So today I'm going to be doing a condensed version of the Scrap and Learn that I had planned. This is going to be significantly longer, but I've been having issues with my video editing software recently, and I haven't been able to fully resolve it. So because of that, I'm going to condense this into a shorter lunch and learn video. So, in order to do that, I should probably have my notes beside me, or else this will be a really boring lunch and learn video. So today's video is on Anne Boleyn. I'm just flipping to my notes because I've already tried to film this or do this once and it didn't work. So I'm gonna try and do it again. Sorry, I hit the microphone with my with my keyboard. So there's no way of knowing specifically when Anne was born. She was born between 1501 and 1507. The reason why... how do I explain this? So the reason why no one knows when she was born is because in those days, the records weren't kept great. They were kept very well for those who were noble, but it wasn't kept well for those who were born common. And Anne Boleyn was born a commoner. So her parents were Thomas Boleyn and Elizabeth Howard. Now, Elizabeth Howard was from the Howard family. The Howard family is a very noble family at this time in England. However, when she married Thomas Boleyn, she ceased to be a Howard and she is a Boleyn now. So yes, they were noble. However, when she married, she gave that up. She had two siblings, Mary and George. If you don't know, Anne Boleyn was the second wife of Henry VIII of England. And, she wasn't his queen for very long, but she was in his life for a considerable amount of time. So she received a very French education, literature, poetry, language. She also learned how to be French in courtly love and flirtation. Now, this was an art form in these days. Women they needed to be chaste and virtuous, but they were still expected to be very flirty and outgoing with the men of the court. So it was an art form that women learned how to strike this balance between the both worlds. Now, Anne Boleyn was known for her temper and her opinion and not keeping those opinions to herself. This caused problems for her in her marriage to Henry. She was a lady in waiting to Catherine of Aragon. However, Catherine was more concerned with getting her daughter the rights of a legitimate princess than with who her husband was having relations with and who his mistresses were. So that was Catherine's main thing. In the spring of 1526, Henry had fallen in love with Anne Boleyn. Now, Henry, he was older than Anne about 10 years, and it was rather unlikely that Anne was setting out to become queen. More likely, she wanted what the French court has, and that was to be the king's only mistress and be placed above all other women except the queen. In 1527, Henry started to question if his marriage to Catherine was valid because Catherine had been married to Henry's brother Arthur, who was the heir to the throne of England. But then he became sick and he died very shortly into their marriage. I think they were only married for about 3 months. And then Arthur died. So there was this question at the time, was the marriage consummated? Eventually, the Pope said that there's not significant evidence to declare that there was the marriage was consummated, so they said that it wasn't, and they gave a papal dispensation for Henry to marry Catherine. This all had to do with money, politics, power, etc. I can talk about Catherine in another video. She's a very fascinating woman. So Henry wanted a divorce from Catherine, essentially. However, in order to do that, he needed the permission of the Pope, because divorce was not something that you just filed for and received in those days. You needed dispensation from the Pope in order for a divorce to be considered legal and valid. So basically, he needed Europe's help. This was a problem because the Pope didn't want to go against Spain. Catherine of Aragon was from Spain. Her nephew was the King of Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor. So very powerful man in Europe. And the Pope didn't want to get in the way of his power, essentially. But he also didn't want to go against Henry and England. So he kind of played them for years. He held off making judgments for a very long time. Sorry. Had to cough. But it should be worth noting that the Vatican did not believe that the marriage to Henry and Catherine was invalid. Everybody believed that it was, that the marriage was legal and valid. To make a very long story short about Henry and Anne, basically Henry wanted a divorce from Catherine or an annulment of their marriage because he wanted to have a son. Catherine had given birth to a couple sons, but none of them lived past infancy. This was a problem for Henry and England at this time because they believed that women couldn't rule the country. Henry had a daughter with Catherine. They had Mary, who does end up ruling England eventually. But Henry was determined to have a son. So he wanted to divorce Catherine on the grounds that their marriage was invalid because she had been married to his brother. And there's a verse in the Bible that says you can't marry your brother's wife, etc., etc. So Henry was bound and determined to divorce Catherine and marry Anne. Because he wanted a son. Let's just face it. So eventually, the Archbishop Cranmer was appointed by the king, who appointed himself the head of the Church of England. And Cranmer ended up granting the divorce on behalf of the English church. So basically, Henry granted his own divorce. Catherine became the Dowager Princess. She was kept away from Mary, and Mary refused to recognize Anne as queen, so she was banished from court and removed from the line of succession. Essentially, anybody who didn't recognize Anne as queen was executed or banished from court. So on May 23rd, 1533, the marriage to Catherine was declared null, and it was later announced Henry and Anne were married. This announcement was made 5 days after. However, they really had exchanged vows and had been married much earlier than this. Anne was about 4 or 5 months pregnant when they did end up getting married. She gave birth on September 7th, 1533 to a daughter. She would become Elizabeth I, who ruled England for many, many years. However, it was a girl. Anne wasn't supposed to have a girl, she was supposed to have a boy. So this was essentially the end for Anne. She did become pregnant again 2 months after the birth of Elizabeth, but that child was either a stillborn or ended in a miscarriage. In 1536, it was obvious that Anne was pregnant again. However, she miscarried a boy, and there is some reports that the baby was deformed, which was a big sign of doing something displeasing to God, witchcraft, adultery, etc. Something to that extent. So Anne blamed it on her deep love for the king at his distress of a major jousting accident. And Henry was livid that she blamed him for this miscarriage or stillbirth. And Anne, by this time, had made an enemy out of Thomas Cromwell. He wanted religious reform, and Anne did as well. But she wanted to keep the monasteries and abbeys open because she felt that poor people needed to go there. That was the only place that they could go to receive any kind of good treatment. So by the time Anne miscarried her last child, Henry had had enough. He wanted a new wife again because of the whole wanting a son. So Cromwell suggested to Henry that Anne had been unfaithful to the king. Anne was an expert at flirtation, so it would have been easy to sell to the court that she had been unfaithful. And further, on top of that, Henry claimed that she bewitched him into marriage. So she could have been charged with witchcraft. I don't think that she ever was, but she could have been. On April 30th, 1536, her lovers were arrested. So Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, and William Brereton. These were all highly placed men at court. And her brother was arrested as well. Yes. And then on May 2nd, 1536, Anne was arrested. Anne and George were tried separately at the Tower. George's wife, Lady Rochford, gave evidence against both of them at trial. All 5 men and Anne were found guilty. But however, the king wanted this, so the outcome against them, it was set from the beginning. On May 17th, 1536, her lovers were executed, and on May 19th, 1536, Anne herself was executed. They brought in an expert swordsman from France for her comfort. And right up until the very end, Anne swore that she was always faithful to the king. Anne was only queen for 3 years, and essentially she was sentenced to death and executed because she didn't give the king a son. So that is a very brief history on Anne Boleyn. The anniversary of her death is coming up soon if anybody would like to mark it. So thank you for watching, and please like and subscribe. Bye.